Hello, I'm Emily Rhodes, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Naples 44 by Norman Lewis. This is the February pick for Emily's Walking Book Club. We now meet 3 times a month to have the opportunity to discuss this one book. We have a monthly walk on Hampstead Heath, another one on Regent's Park, and we also have a Monday evening Zoom in case you can't make it along in person. Alongside these chances to meet up, there's also a weekly newsletter, which is free. And on that newsletter, you'll find links to read more about the book, some discussion points to get you thinking. And once a month, I also send a link to this monthly webcast where I try and give you a little bit of an introductory natter to myself about this book and maybe pick up on one or two of the key ideas that really piqued my interest and maybe the interest of the group as well. And I'll read a bit out. So, Naples 44 is, as the title suggests, a record of what Naples was like in 1944. So this is just when the Allies landed at the south of Italy and were working their way up to take Italy back from its occupation by the Nazis. Norman Lewis was English, so he was one of the Allies, and he was an intelligence officer, and he is sent there, and he kept a log or a kind of diary, which I think I'm right in saying this. I think he then reworked and polished and turned into this, quite beautiful, vivid, elegantly written book, which was published in the 70s. What is missing in the book, I would say, is a feeling of plot, character development, and kind of narrative. That the wanting to meeting a character, seeing how they get on, what crises are they going to deal with, and where are they going to end up. It's very fragmented. It really takes the form of diary entries, and I think I found that a little challenging, and I think other people did too. But it does make it a really nice book to dip in and out of, even if it's hard, therefore, to kind of sit down and read a lot of it at once. What you get in spades in this book are really incredible observations of, the time and place, Naples in 1944. And Norman Lewis's eye, he has a great eye for the telling detail, whether that's the clothes or the food. He writes very beautifully. It really feels like his sympathies are very much with the Neapolitan people, more so perhaps than with the Allies. And there's a kind of curiosity and warmth and generosity of spirit in his writing. I think he loved Italians and really felt for them, felt for their plight in this book. It's incredibly shocking in parts, and it's really upsetting to read. Perhaps one might naively think the Allies came and liberated Italy and then everything was okay. It's very much not the case. There's famine, there are these moments that illustrate it so well. When he's first approaching Naples, he writes about being miles out of the centre and seeing all these women just picking the weeds from the ground, to harvesting them to eat. And there's like miles out of the centre, and then from that point inwards, there was nothing on the earth. It all gone. I think there's even something like the fish in the aquarium had been eaten. There literally wasn't a crumb. There's this wonderful character, Latarullo, one of the book's few characters. He comes up a few times, and in fact I will read a bit out, where he exists on, I think, one meal a day of bread dipped in olive oil, sometimes with a tomato on it, and he kind of gets around this predicament of not having enough food. He's constantly about to kind of faint from hunger, by spending most of his time, I think, lying down or sitting down, going on a very short walk, stopping throughout this daily walk at churches to sit down and rest. Occasionally there's this brilliant phrase of sort of starving socially with someone else in the same predicament of his. Latarullo's particular predicament is not just thanks to the war, and I think this is a slight theme of the book. There are these atrocities that are, you know, really thanks to the war, or the situation that is perhaps exacerbated by the war. But even without the war, there's so much in Naples that is so incredibly different to life in England. So with Latarullo, okay, I hope I get this right, he says something like he's one of a class of professionals where there's this sort of great honour in being professional. So there are far too many lawyers, for instance, in Naples. None of them have enough work, but they couldn't ever debase themselves by doing kind of anything else. And Latarullo gets around this by occasionally being the uncle from Rome who sort of shows up at a funeral and gets paid to do this, but he can't, you know, debase himself by doing any work that might get his hands dirty. So even before the war, he was completely impoverished, and there were sort of, I think, thousands of similar men in that situation. The situation of women in the book is another one. It's something that was actually incredibly difficult for us to talk about, really seeing the horrors, and he's really quite explicit about what the women have to do to survive, and I think, you know, I don't think anybody felt they could read this book, and while it's so very rooted in Naples in 1944, it feels like these atrocities, of course, are still going on in war-torn places all over the world today, and that felt very upsetting, reading it as a woman today, or, you know, as any human today, I think. However, there were certain things that were, you know, less upsetting about the women, and their kind of how absolutely important sex was to women and society in general. And there are these things like these, some of the women have these pockmarked bottoms from these injections they get to keep them at the height of their sexual powers, and elsewhere it's mentioned that at sort of lunchtime, you know, it's absolutely a dishonour if your lover doesn't visit you in the middle of the day to have sex with you. And there are all and then there's one officer who's kind of can't cope with this Neapolitan woman, Lola, who talks about how her husband, even when he was, you know, dying, I think from tuberculosis or something, would make love to her, you know, at least 7 times every night. So there are these kind of wonderful touches, and I think it was particularly funny, that element was particularly funny or remarkable, reading that, having just read Excellent Women by Barbara Pym, where, you know, it's only a decade later, the women, I mean, and none of those women were having injections in their bottoms. I don't know, maybe Allegra Gray, but no, honestly, it was, we really kind of laughed to try and imagine any of the characters in Excellent Women in Naples and what they'd make of it. And of course, Rocky, one of the main characters in Excellent Women, has just come from having spent the war in exactly this place in the south of Italy. So that was a sort of funny thing to think about. The other big difference between these two books, and another point that we really talked about, was belief and superstition and the role of the church. You know, in Excellent Women, the church is a place of community and organising bazaars, and, you know, having a chat with the vicar, maybe singing a hymn. It's not somewhere that performs miracles kind of to order, where you're waiting for the blood to congeal. You really believe that a saint is going to stop the flow of lava from when Vesuvius erupts. And there's an amazing moment when Vesuvius erupts and they're all waiting for the saint to stop it, and then I think they brought another saint as a sort of backup in case the patron saint of the area isn't sufficiently effective, but they have to hide the other saint behind a sheet in the back street just so that the current saint isn't offended. Anyway, the bit I'm going to read out is about that, and it is about Latarullo, who we all felt very fond of. My book is actually kind of crinkly from the terrible weather and rain that we endured on our walk in Hampstead Heath. So this is where he's reporting a conversation he's had with Latarullo, the sort of impoverished lawyer. So Norman Lewis writes, "It appears now that the Whitsun pilgrimage to Monte Vergine has definitely been vetoed, and this is a source of great public disappointment and some criticism. This pilgrimage to the ancient shrine of Cybele near Avellino has been going on for 600 years. Since a miraculous picture of the Virgin was presented to the shrine by Catherine of Valois, and it is seen by the 50,000 or more devotees of this cult as dangerous to cancel an institution of this magnitude and spiritual value merely because there's a war on." Then there's a little bit more about the pilgrimage. "The public frustration over the pilgrimage was made much of by Latarullo, who said that, among others, his aunt was very upset. Never having seen this aunt, who is supposed to live with him, or noticed the slightest sign of her presence in his flat, I'm beginning to suspect she doesn't exist, and that he uses this fictitious personality as a showcase for all these Neapolitan prejudices of which he pretends to be ashamed. Apart from Vittorio Emanuele's salver, the only object in Latarullo's flat by which he sets any store is a large and dingy-looking piece of rock, which when first showing me he handled with the most reverent care. This was a souvenir from the cave sanctuary of St. Michael at Monte Sant'Angelo, and of course it belonged not to him, but to his mysterious aunt. Latarullo is a highly educated man, with a cosmopolitan outlook and a wide grasp of world affairs, who reads everything he can lay his hands on, including 15 or 20 newspapers a day, 3 or 4 days out of date when he buys them, which can be picked up at the vegetable market for 2 or 3 lire a bundle. It is difficult for a man of his intellectual calibre to admit to me that he believes that San Gennaro can stop the flow of lava from Vesuvius, or that a monk in Pomigliano is flying about like a bird. So he gets round it by saying, 'My dear old aunt believes in this kind of thing. I don't want to argue with her. I only report these things to you to give you some idea of the mentality you're dealing with. As in the case of this Monte Vergine affair, I feel you should know. Mass hypnosis, I agree with you. You may well be right. But you have to remember that more people in this town share my aunt's point of view than mine.'" I love that bit for so many reasons. One, I think I really have been quite inspired to try and invent an aunt who I can blame my slightly bonkers beliefs on. You know that feeling when you're not kind of, I don't know, you have a sort of idea that is maybe a little mad. I think it would be quite good to blame it on a fictitious aunt. But no, jokes aside, I think you know, you can really see when you read the book and you see the absolute horrors that everyone is enduring in Naples, and you get this feeling that so many different people have been in charge. You know, we talked, you know, there's this huge kind of power struggle and dynamic in the book where the Allies are supposed to sort of be ruling over the Neapolitans, but of course they're not really, because the Neapolitans aren't very compliant, and there's also the Gomorrah, and there's also the women, and there's also the black market, and there's the police, and there are two types of police. You know, it's very complicated, but this is a place that has been ruled over and invaded and conquered sort of time and time again by different factions. And throughout this, you know, when they talk about this pilgrimage that it's been going on for 600 years, you know, if here is this constant that gets you this direct route to God, it kind of allows people to rise above the immediate horrors of the day-to-day. And it's quite astonishing, you know, reading about that. And I also think, you know, if things are so dreadful, you need to have hope. You do really need to believe that a saint can stop the lava, or whatever it is. And so clever Latarullo for kind of finding his way of expressing this. I think it's absolutely brilliant. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot in this book. I think everyone either really liked it or were kind of slightly so-so. Nobody didn't like it. And I think on drilling into what people were a little lukewarm about, it was really a feeling of just wanting more Latarullos, you know, more of these characters. Lola's another good one. There are one or two others. And the time you spend with them is so kind of gorgeous. You know, it's a real pleasure, and it's really fascinating. And I suppose I would have loved to spend more time in Latarullo's company and see him progress a little bit more, rather than it being these quite distanced observations without much of a sense of plot. But yeah, a fantastic book, really interesting for getting, you know, a huge insight into this city at this time, and also a very different side of books about the Second World War. Yeah, highly recommend. Love to know your thoughts about it. That's the February book. Our March book is here. Hang on. Mr. Ma and Son by Lao She. Looking forward to chatting about that one with you next month.